looking forward to our chat today, and quite selfishly, this is a great way to catch up. I feel really excited to have followed your journey with She's a Crowd over the last couple of years. It's Porch Placemaking Week, and so I'm sitting here in my front yard, which is a private space and one that I feel relatively safe in. But 9 out of 10 women, a Plan International study found, don't feel safe in public spaces. And of course, I want to acknowledge right now, in the midst of COVID, that many women also don't feel safe at home. But today I do want to focus on public spaces. Before we jump into that, can you describe yourself as a data activist and a gender advocate? Can you talk to us a little bit about what you do and why you do what you do?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me as well. I'm also on my porch in Dharawal country, and just want to pay my respects as well to the people here that I'm calling in from. And I love porches too, because I think they're an interesting public-private space. And yeah, I guess to give you a little introduction about myself. So I run a feminist tech startup called She's a Crowd, and we use crowdsourced data to make cities safer for women and gender diverse people, and to try to close the gender data gap that we see. We know that, as you mentioned, so one statistic I know that you just reminded me of is that 9 in 10 women have experienced street harassment and have had to modify their behaviour as a result of that. And we know around 90% of sexual assault is never reported. So obviously we've got this huge gap here around what's actually happening, and yeah, between what's actually happening and what's actually being reported and what's available in terms of data. So our anonymous storytelling platform allows anyone to geolocatively share their story, and we use those data to work with decision makers.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I want to start with a big question. It's 2021 and there's probably more investment in public space and streets now, particularly in the last 2 years, than there has ever been. So why is it that so many women and people who are gender diverse still experience street harassment or still feel unsafe when they're out and about in public?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that unless we design for the person who has the most barriers to accessing public space, we don't design spaces for everyone at all. I think there's also a lot of misconceptions about the way that women and gender diverse people experience safety. I think that we're only just beginning to be able to articulate what that actually looks and feels like for us. And I think that this question in particular speaks to perception of safety. At She's a Crowd, we consider perception of safety to be just as important as actual incidents of safety, specifically in terms of how people access and feel accessing public space. So when we think about something like accessibility of public space or safety in public space, we often think about really tangible things such as lighting, sidewalks, like CCTV or something like that. And I think that these things are really important and they definitely play a part. But what we hear so much from so many women and gender diverse people who share through our platform or in our focus groups is that there is a broader feeling going on of not feeling welcome, or not feeling like it's our space, or not feeling like the city is working for us. And I think that's because just layers and layers and layers upon layers of history in our cities has always been, there's a motorbike going past, has always been kind of designed, and cities have always been designed and developed by men and for men. And I think we feel that in the space. Just to give you an example, I think something that we find that women in particular say across our focus groups research, across our data, is that they would like to see more passive surveillance in public. So they'd like conductors back on trams, for example, not PSOs, not police, but just a friendly bystander, and they want bystanders to be more aware. And I think that this is one example I use because this is the type of thing that comes up so much but is consistently shut down by decision makers as an option that's not even going to be considered. And I think that this is because it's really not about how much we are spending, but about what we're prioritizing. Like, we know we have all the money and the food in the world to end global poverty, and yet, you know, we don't end it. We know that, you know, there's technologies that are developed that are amazing AI that still doesn't consider women's perspective or is in fact sexist. It's not really about, like, you know, how much money we have for something, but what we're actually prioritizing. We know that the Apple Watch only developed a period tracker like a year or two ago, when periods are like one of the key indicators of health for women. Like, these examples from other, you know, sectors, obviously, but I think it speaks to this idea that it's not that we don't have the tools, it's not that we don't have the funding, it's that we're not invested in understanding the problem and invested in solving it. We're working on a bike project at the moment, and we know that end of trip facilities are really important for to get more women riding their bikes, because they're concerned about how they present at work and not having helmet hair and not being sweaty and what they wear. And that is something that's not really taken seriously as a concern in public space design, just like many of our kind of concerns and experiences aren't really prioritized or taken seriously. So.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned there around actually understanding the lived experience of the people that you're designing for. I mean, it should be design 101, like, who are we designing for and what their needs are, but
yeah,
that hasn't historically been the case, which, you know, in some ways is why your work is so important. And I want to talk about data for a moment and storytelling into that space. And you describe yourself as a data activist. There's the old saying that you can't manage what you can't measure. You know, if you can't describe what the problem is, it's very hard to solve it. Can you talk a little bit about how data is being used to help shed light on some of these issues?
Yeah.
And I personally love data, as you know. So
I know you and I have this in common. I mean, like, you totally love data. I totally love data. We both know why it's important. I think I want to speak about why it might be in particular important or hold some particular weight, specifically around like women and gender diverse issues. And I think that's because, like, historically, our stories aren't really like taken seriously or even believed. And I think, like, we have these conversations so often where, you know, you'll be in a group of women and you'll all be talking and you all kind of know this type of thing goes on. Like, we've all had countless stories of street harassment or sexual assault, and yet it's not reflected in the data. And it's just this funny thing where we all talk about it, we know it's happening, and then it's just not reflected across space and time in data. And so what I found is really interesting is like this question of how do you bridge the divide between the stories that we anecdotally share and we know, you know, go on, and data that's going to be taken seriously by decision makers. And I had like such an interesting wake-up call a few years ago around this, where when I was working on Free to Be, which was Australia's first crowd mapping platform for street harassment, and we collected all these geolocative stories on a map, and I just showed the decision makers the map with all the stories on it, and all of a sudden they were like, there's so much data here, this is a really serious problem, we had no idea. And I was like, literally just the stories, like nothing fancy, just qualitative experiences from people, but put on a map was suddenly just so much more tangible to people and illustrative, and people could really visualize and imagine the problem. And I think data, it's so much about communication and illustration and creativity and how you actually want to communicate the problem. And it's so important that we're invested in understanding this problem before jumping to solutions.
Yeah, and that's so critical what you've highlighted. And I think what I love about what She's a Crowd does is you look at the qualitative as well as the quantitative, and you're looking at that storytelling element. And while I'm on that very serious point, I've got a train going past, which is the beauty of doing recordings outside as well. But just to think about that, I mean, one of the challenges, and I've observed as someone who's, you know, spent their career in urban planning, is that people focus a lot on reported crime. And so it's like, well, if we increase lighting, we might reduce reported crime. And that might be true, but it has not much bearing to people's actual perception of place. And you know, to your earlier point, a perception is a reality. Like, it's, if you don't feel safe, you're not safe. Can you talk a little bit about how you use storytelling, I guess, to bring like deeper understanding of different experiences of spaces?
Yeah, I think that's the key word, is like a deeper understanding, and stories have so much depth to them. I think sometimes we think about safety and we think about like something like CCTV, and just one example is how, you know, male on male violence, yes, it's a big problem, especially in public space, but it's something that can be captured on CCTV. Usually there are bystanders, and usually it can be reported with clear evidence. But something, the gendered experiences of harassment or assault are often just so covert and so can fly under the radar of CCTV or even of bystander awareness. In terms of our data, like, we collect both quantitative and qualitative, but we always find that when people have the ability to share their story in their own words, we can delve right into that and see things we wouldn't have even necessarily thought to ask for. And I think, like, we're not necessarily, decision makers aren't even necessarily thinking to ask the right questions. There are so many barriers to reporting when the goal of reporting is only to seek individual justice through the justice system. That's not something that everybody necessarily wants to do. So what other portals do we have for kind of reporting these types of experiences? I feel very passionately about storytelling. I've never underestimated the power of it. Like, on a personal level, I noticed that when I started sharing my stories of gender-based violence, there's a lot of shame in particular around this issue, and there's a lot of self-blame. And I think that sharing your story around this issue helps other people feel more power to do the same and less shame. And I think that that's really important to understand, is this is not just like collecting any type of data. There is so much stigma and fear and shame around these particular types of experiences. So we need platforms that understand that and use a trauma-informed approach to collecting those data. And I just feel like on a short-term level, what we know that we do at She's a Crowd is provide that type of experience for people. And we have people tell us all the time, like, sharing my story with She's a Crowd is the first time I'd shared it in years. It helped me get the confidence to tell my partner or tell my family or tell the police. And so I think even I underestimated the power of just like being able to share your story through a supportive platform.
I love the power of storytelling, and I think it's something that doesn't come up enough sometimes when you know, people are talking about data. They're thinking about your map, and they're not always thinking about the power of everything that comes behind that, but also the confidence of the individuals gained in being able to be on that journey is also incredible. A lot of people that are participating in Porch Placemaking Week, you know, community leaders, placemakers, urban planners, people who are involved or care about cities in some ways, and, you know, the role of public space is kind of the foundation of cities. What advice would you have for urban planners who are thinking about some of the issues that we've discussed today about gender inclusion and making public spaces safer, particularly for people who are women or gender diverse?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've just met so many amazing and passionate planners. And I think, you know, what we really need is to be committed to understanding the problem before jumping to the solution. There's a lot of like misconceptions and assumptions, I think, that are made around this. We've touched on those a little bit already. I think I'd love to see decision makers think carefully and be really thoughtful about what women are actually telling us, and how that can inform decision making. Something that I see just so often is, if you're creating a policy that's, you know, you're creating a car spaces policy or a, you know, cycling plan or, you know, whatever it might be. And you've often got like your gender policy over here, and then you've got your, you know, use of public space policies over here. And I'll do word searches and not find the word gender, woman, women, female in those policies. And I would just love to see gender mainstreamed across policy as a starting point. That is something that I would recommend decision makers start with, is when you're creating these policies, to go back to the gender inclusion policy, go back to, you know, all of your accessibility policies, and make sure that they're also reflected in the use of space policies as well, because that's, I think, the starting point, and we need to filter. We're really at that. We're still quite early in this journey, and we need to start at that policy level.
It's a really interesting point. I remember meeting with the city of Vancouver with their urban planning department a couple of years ago, and their approach to gender mainstreaming, and they were just at the beginning of their journey, but probably quite advanced compared to most cities. And the simplest thing that they did, which I thought should just be mainstreamed everywhere, was that they had to, as a checkbox, ask the question on every single policy and piece of legislation, how has gender been considered? And that simple act of just having to ask that question led to dramatic change, because people were like, oh yeah, well actually I didn't go back to our other gender policy when I was creating this landscape master plan or other things like that. And they had to demonstrate that they'd asked the question and how. And that felt like a really easy first step in gender mainstreaming that I think a lot of cities can apply in policy. Zoe, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate you taking time outside on your porch, and it looks sunnier where you are than where I am. How can people find out more about you and your work?
Thanks for having me, Lucinda. We are all over the social media. So we've got our She's a Crowd Instagram at She's a Crowd, www.she'sacrowd.com. Or if you want to get in touch about working with us, we have a new insights dashboard where local governments and planners can access all of our live data. And you can contact me. There's a chat going past. You can contact me at zoe@she'sacrowd.com.
Zoe, thanks so much for joining me today.